The emergency broadcast crackled through the abandoned convenience store, its automated voice echoing against shelves stripped bare of anything useful. Marcus Williams pressed his back against the cold metal of the storage room door, his breath coming in controlled, measured intervals despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 23 days had passed since the world ended, though it felt like a lifetime ago when he kissed his daughter goodbye at her college dormitory, promising to pick her up for Thanksgiving break. Now, Thanksgiving seemed like a holiday from another universe entirely, and his daughter Emily remained 300 miles away in a city that had gone completely dark on day 4. The moaning outside grew louder, and Marcus could hear the distinctive shuffle of feet dragging across broken glass. He'd counted 7 of them when he ducked inside, drawn by the sound of his motorcycle engine, but sound traveled differently now in the silence of civilization's collapse, and there could be dozens for all he knew. Across the store, hidden behind an overturned magazine rack, Rebecca Torres held her 9-year-old son Daniel against her chest, one hand firmly but gently covering his mouth. She'd learned quickly that children didn't understand the new rules of survival, that the instinct to cry out when frightened had to be suppressed at all costs. Daniel's eyes were wide but trusting, and he'd become remarkably good at staying silent in the 3 weeks since they'd fled their apartment complex. Rebecca's police training had kept them alive so far, but her ammunition was running critically low, down to 6 rounds in her service weapon and nothing else. She'd seen Marcus enter the store and recognized the tactical way he moved, the awareness of someone who'd either served in the military or learned survival the hard way since the outbreak began. She made a calculated decision and whispered so quietly into Daniel's ear that even she barely heard it, then slowly raised her hand where Marcus could see it, palm open, signaling she wasn't a threat. Marcus's eyes locked onto the movement, his own weapon halfway drawn before he processed what he was seeing. A woman and a child, both very much alive, both in desperate need of staying that way. He nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement, and gestured toward the storage room door behind him with 2 fingers. The loading dock would be their exit if they could reach it without drawing the infected inside. But then the front window shattered, and all plans evaporated like morning mist. The infected didn't climb or strategize, but they pushed and pressed and eventually overwhelmed any obstacle through sheer mindless persistence. The first one tumbled through the broken window, its gray-tinged flesh torn and hanging from its arms, its eyes milky white and seeing nothing but somehow knowing exactly where the living waited. Rebecca moved first, pulling Daniel toward the back of the store as Marcus emerged from cover, a crowbar in his hands instead of the gun Rebecca expected. Smart, she thought, no noise to draw more of them. He brought the crowbar down with practiced efficiency, and the infected crumpled without ceremony. But 2 more were already climbing through, and Rebecca could see movement in the parking lot beyond, dozens of shapes lurching toward the commotion. Marcus caught her eye and shouted the first words either had spoken aloud in days, "Loading dock now." They ran together, Daniel between them, as the store filled with the sounds of the dead reclaiming another piece of the world. The loading dock door was chained from the outside, and Marcus cursed, slamming his shoulder against it uselessly. Rebecca was already scanning for alternatives when Daniel, pressed against the wall in terror, accidentally triggered the manual override for the old delivery elevator. The grinding of ancient gears was deafening, but the floor panel slid open, revealing a dark shaft leading down into the basement level. Marcus didn't hesitate, dropping into the darkness and landing hard on concrete 8 feet below. Rebecca lowered Daniel into his waiting arms, then dropped down herself just as the first infected burst through the storage room door above them. In the pitch blackness of the basement, with the sounds of chaos echoing from above, 3 strangers who'd become reluctant allies by necessity pressed forward into the unknown, unaware that this abandoned store sat directly above something that would change everything they thought they knew about the outbreak, about survival, and about whether humanity had any future left to fight for. The basement air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something chemical that made Rebecca's nose wrinkle as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Marcus pulled a small flashlight from his jacket, the beam cutting through the blackness to reveal a space far larger than any convenience store storage area had right to be. The concrete floor stretched out before them, marked with faded yellow lines that looked like parking space indicators, and along the walls stood rows of metal shelving units covered in dust and debris. Daniel clung to his mother's leg, trembling but silent, his training in this new terrible world holding firm even as the sounds of the infected above them grew more frantic. Rebecca could hear them pacing, searching, their feet scraping across the floor in that distinctive shuffle that now haunted her dreams. Marcus moved the flashlight beam methodically across the space, and that's when they all saw it. A heavy steel door set into the far wall, marked with a faded government seal and words that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Federal Emergency Management Agency, authorized personnel only, ST 1962. Marcus approached the door cautiously, his flashlight revealing a keypad entry system that looked far more modern than the Cold War-era signage suggested. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why would a FEMA bunker be under a convenience store in the middle of nowhere?" Rebecca joined him, her police instincts immediately suspicious of anything government-related that had been kept secret. She'd heard rumors during her years on the force, whispers about contingency plans and emergency protocols that seemed too paranoid to be real, but standing here in the darkness with the world ending above them, paranoia seemed like it might have been justified all along. The keypad glowed green when Marcus touched it, still powered by something after all these years, and a small screen flickered to life displaying a simple message: "Emergency protocol active, biometric lock disengaged, enter." Daniel was the first to notice the photographs, his small hand tugging on Rebecca's sleeve as he pointed to a bulletin board mounted beside the door. Marcus swung the flashlight over, illuminating dozens of pictures pinned haphazardly across the cork surface, some old and faded, others disturbingly recent. Rebecca's breath caught as she recognized locations from the outbreak, time-stamped images of infected in various stages of transformation, clinical notes scrawled in the margins using terminology she didn't understand. But it was the newest edition that made her stomach drop. A photograph dated 5 days ago showing this very town from an aerial view, with circles drawn around specific buildings including the convenience store above their heads, and a single word written in red marker: checkpoint. Someone had been here recently, someone who was documenting the outbreak with scientific precision, and they'd marked this location as significant for reasons Rebecca couldn't begin to guess. Marcus's hand hovered over the door handle, every instinct telling him that opening it would change everything, that whatever lay beyond that threshold was connected to the nightmare that had consumed the world. He thought of Emily, wondered if she'd found shelter, if she was even still alive, and knew that any information about the outbreak's origin might be the key to finding a cure, to getting back to her. He looked at Rebecca, saw the same desperate hope mixed with fear in her eyes, and knew she was thinking about giving Daniel a future worth surviving for. The decision made itself, really, because what choice did they have with the infected above them and nowhere else to run? The handle turned smoothly despite decades of disuse, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a corridor lit by emergency lighting that stretched impossibly far into the earth. The air that rushed out was cool and filtered, carrying with it the hum of machinery that should have been impossible in a world where the power grid had failed everywhere else. They stepped through together, Marcus leading with Rebecca and Daniel close behind, and the door sealed shut automatically behind them with a pressurized hiss that spoke of airlocks and containment protocols. The corridor walls were lined with more photographs, more documents, and as they walked deeper, Rebecca began to piece together a timeline that made her question everything she thought she knew about when the outbreak had actually started, because according to the dates on these files, someone had been expecting this catastrophe for more than 20 years. The corridor opened into a vast operations center that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, coffee cups still sitting on workstations beside computers that hummed with patient persistence, waiting for operators who would never return. Marcus swept his flashlight across multiple screens displaying maps of the United States, each one covered in red zones that had spread like a virus itself across the digital landscape, timestamp readings showing the progression from day 1 to day 23 in horrifying detail. Rebecca moved to the nearest workstation, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she pressed a key and watched the primary monitor flicker to full brightness. What she saw made her throat tighten with anger and disbelief. Video feeds from thousands of cameras across the country, most showing static or empty streets, but some still broadcasting live footage of the infected wandering through the ruins of American cities. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a monitoring station, a place where someone had been watching civilization collapse in real time, and from the looks of the dated equipment mixed with newer technology, they'd been preparing to watch it for decades. Daniel had wandered toward a wall covered in what looked like organizational charts, his child's curiosity overriding his fear now that they were safely sealed away from the monsters above. He traced his finger along lines connecting names and photographs, some marked with red X's, others with green check marks, and still others with yellow highlighting that seemed to indicate something he didn't understand. Rebecca joined him, reading the header at the top of the largest chart: Project Lazarus, personnel status, updated 72 hours ago. 72 hours ago meant someone had been here 3 days prior, updating these charts while Rebecca and Daniel had been hiding in an abandoned pharmacy 15 miles away, rationing stale crackers and warm bottled water. Marcus noticed it too, his military bearing shifting into high alert as he checked corners and doorways with renewed caution, because if someone had been here recently, they might still be close, and in this new world, other survivors could be just as dangerous as the infected. The sound of footsteps echoing from deeper within the facility froze all three of them in place, and Marcus immediately moved Daniel and Rebecca behind a bank of filing cabinets, his crowbar raised and ready. The footsteps were measured, calm, nothing like the shuffle of the infected, and when the figure emerged from a doorway marked Residential Wing B, Marcus found himself staring at a man in his 60s wearing a cardigan sweater and wire-rimmed glasses, looking for all the world like someone's grandfather rather than a survivor of the apocalypse. The man stopped when he saw them, showing no fear, only a weary sort of resignation that suggested he'd been expecting company eventually. "My name is Dr. Howard Patterson," he said quietly, his hands visible and empty, his posture deliberately non-threatening. "I'm a microbiologist, and I've been stationed at this facility for the past 8 months preparing for an outbreak that my colleagues assured me would never happen." His voice carried the weight of someone who desperately wished he'd been wrong, and when Rebecca stepped out from behind cover, her weapon drawn but not aimed, he simply nodded as if this was all perfectly reasonable. Marcus didn't lower the crowbar, his eyes scanning for signs of deception, but Dr. Patterson seemed genuine in his exhaustion and defeat. "You've seen the archives," the old man said, gesturing toward the walls covered in documentation. "Then you know this wasn't some random mutation or natural disaster. Project Lazarus was a containment protocol for a bioweapon that was never supposed to leave laboratory conditions, but someone made a choice and here we are." Rebecca felt Daniel press closer to her, and she kept her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "You're telling me this was deliberate? That someone released this intentionally?" Dr. Patterson moved to one of the workstations and pulled up a file, his fingers shaking slightly as he typed. The screen filled with classified documents, emails between government officials and military contractors, and at the center of it all, a single directive issued 30 days before the first outbreak. Initiate Lazarus Protocol population control measures approved, containment optional. The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical presence, and Marcus had to grip the edge of a desk to steady himself as the implications crashed through his understanding of everything. This wasn't about survival or finding a cure. This was about discovering that the enemy wasn't just the infected stumbling through the streets above, but the people who'd decided humanity needed culling and had the means to make it happen. Rebecca's finger moved to the trigger of her weapon, years of police training warring with the knowledge that shooting this old man wouldn't undo what had been done, wouldn't bring back the world that had been stolen from her son. "How many people knew?" she asked, her voice deadly calm in the way that Marcus recognized as far more dangerous than shouting. Dr. Patterson sank into a nearby chair, suddenly looking every one of his years and then some. "At the highest levels? Maybe 24 across military intelligence, FEMA, and private contractors. At my level, just doing our jobs without knowing the full picture? Hundreds of us, I suppose. I was told we were developing countermeasures against foreign bioweapons, that Project Lazarus was purely defensive research." He pulled off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with a trembling hand. "I didn't know they'd synthesized a deployment-ready version until I received emergency orders to evacuate to this monitoring station 8 months ago. Even then, I thought it was just precautionary that cooler heads would prevail, but then the first cases appeared in Detroit, then Atlanta, then Seattle, and I watched on these screens as everything I'd helped create in ignorance consumed the country city by city." Marcus moved to the workstation and began scrolling through the files, his jaw clenched tight as he absorbed information that rewrote his entire understanding of the outbreak. The pathogen had been engineered to spread through fluid contact, to reanimate basic motor functions while destroying higher brain activity, creating exactly the kind of chaos they'd all been living through. But there were references to something called Generation 2 that made his skin crawl, mentions of adaptation and evolution that suggested the infected wouldn't stay mindless forever. "What's Generation 2? He demanded, turning on Dr. Patterson with barely controlled fury. The old scientist's face went even paler, and he stood slowly, walking to a locked cabinet that he opened with a key from around his neck. Inside were vials of clear liquid and thick binders full of research data, and when he pulled out one specific folder marked with red stripes, his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "The pathogen was designed with a built-in evolution mechanism," Dr. Patterson explained, his voice barely a whisper. "Generation 1 creates the initial outbreak, the shambling infected that destroy infrastructure and spread panic. But the virus doesn't stop there. It continues to mutate in the host bodies, repairing neurological damage over time, restoring cognitive function while maintaining the aggressive tendencies and enhanced physical resilience. He opened the folder to reveal photographs that made Rebecca pull Daniel closer and turn his face away. The images showed infected that looked different from the mindless creatures they'd been fleeing, these ones moving with purpose, using tools, working together with visible intelligence, burning in eyes that were no longer milky white but clear and aware and utterly inhuman in their cold calculation. According to the projections, Generation 2 emergence should begin around day 30 to 40 in the initial infected. That gives us approximately 1 week before everything gets exponentially worse. The lights in the facility suddenly flickered, and a computerized voice echoed through the speakers mounted in the ceiling. Warning, perimeter breach detected, unauthorized access at entry point 7, security protocols initiating. Dr. Patterson's expression shifted from despair to immediate alarm as he rushed to a security monitor, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. The screen divided into multiple camera feeds showing the convenience store above them, but what Marcus saw made his blood turn to ice. The infected that had been mindlessly wandering the aisles were now gathered around the loading dock elevator shaft, and they weren't just stumbling around randomly anymore. They were organized, working together to pry open the doors, and leading them was a figure that moved with unmistakable intelligence, directing the others with gestures and what appeared to be rudimentary communication. "That's impossible," Dr. Patterson breathed, his face reflecting the blue glow of the monitors. "Generation 2 isn't supposed to emerge for another week at minimum. Unless..." He pulled up another file, and Rebecca saw the truth in his eyes before he even spoke it. "Unless the initial release wasn't 23 days ago like the official reports claimed. Unless it started earlier than any of us knew, and someone has been lying about the timeline from the very beginning." Marcus was already moving toward the corridor they'd entered through, knowing that if the infected could organize, could think and plan, then nowhere was safe anymore, not even a bunker buried beneath the earth. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the facility as something immensely strong began forcing open the elevator shaft doors far above them, and Daniel finally broke his silence with a single terrified word that spoke for all of them: "Run." Dr. Patterson grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength for a man his age, yanking him back from the corridor entrance. "Not that way," he said urgently, already moving toward a different door marked Research Level, Sublevel 3. "This facility goes down 7 stories, and there's an emergency evacuation tunnel that exits 2 miles from here. If we're lucky, they don't know about it yet." Rebecca scooped Daniel into her arms despite his protest that he could run, her maternal instincts overriding everything else as the grinding metal sounds grew louder and more insistent. The 4 of them raced through a maze of corridors that all looked identical, white walls and fluorescent lighting creating a disorienting sameness that would have been easy to get lost in without a guide. Marcus kept glancing back, expecting at any moment to see those intelligent eyes appearing behind them, to hear footsteps that moved with purpose rather than the mindless shuffle they'd grown accustomed to evading. The stairwell leading down was narrow, designed for emergency use only, and their footsteps rang out against the metal steps in a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud. They descended past Sublevel 2 where Dr. Patterson explained the main laboratories were located, past Sublevel 3 where living quarters and supply storage took up entire football field-sized spaces, and kept going down into sections that grew progressively colder and more industrial. At Sublevel 5, Dr. Patterson stopped at a security door and pressed his hand against a biometric scanner that beeped its acceptance after a moment's hesitation. The door slid open to reveal a space that made Rebecca's police training immediately recognize as a command center designed for military operations rather than scientific research. Banks of weapons lined one wall, everything from assault rifles to grenades, all neatly organized and labeled with inventory tags. Marcus moved toward them instinctively, but froze when he saw the figure sitting calmly at the central command console, watching their entrance on multiple monitor screens with an expression of mild interest. The woman was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in tactical gear that showed signs of heavy use, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, and her eyes carrying the flat, emotionless quality of someone who'd seen too much and felt too little. "Dr. Patterson," she said without turning around, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "I was wondering when you'd realize you had company upstairs." I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Hayes, formerly of USAMRIAD, currently the last surviving member of the Lazarus Oversight Committee. She finally swiveled her chair to face them, and Rebecca noticed the sidearm holstered at her hip, the relaxed but ready posture of someone completely confident in her ability to handle any threat. I've been monitoring your progress since you entered the facility 37 minutes ago, and I have to say, I'm impressed you made it this far with a child in tow. Marcus positioned himself protectively between Hayes and the others, his mind racing through tactical scenarios, but the lieutenant colonel simply smiled without warmth. Relax, Mr. Williams. If I wanted you dead, you'd have never made it past the operations center. I've been alone down here for 3 weeks since my team was overrun during a surface reconnaissance mission, and frankly, I could use the company even if it comes with complications. Dr. Patterson moved forward slowly, recognition dawning on his face. You're Jennifer Hayes? The one who sent the evacuation orders 8 months ago? I thought you were operating out of Fort Detrick. Hayes nodded, her expression revealing nothing. I was, until Fort Detrick became ground zero for what we're now calling the accelerated mutation event. Turns out when you concentrate the highest number of infected research subjects in one location and the containment fails, evolution happens much faster than the models predicted. Generation 2 didn't emerge from the wild population, Doctor. It emerged from our own test subjects, and then it escaped and started converting others. The facility shook suddenly, dust raining down from the ceiling as something massive impacted the upper levels with tremendous force. The monitor screens flickered and several went dark, but those remaining showed the convenience store above completely overrun with infected that were now methodically tearing apart the loading dock, exposing the elevator shaft like surgeons opening a patient. Hayes stood smoothly, gathering weapons from the wall with practiced efficiency and tossing a rifle to Marcus, who caught it reflexively. We have approximately 10 minutes before they breach sublevel 1, maybe 20 before they figure out the stairwell access points. The evacuation tunnel is our only option, but there's something you all need to understand before we go topside. She pulled up a map on the console showing the surrounding area marked with dozens of red indicators clustered in specific patterns. The intelligent ones aren't just random mutations. They're forming communities, building something that looks disturbingly like a society, and we're sitting right in the middle of their largest settlement zone. Rebecca stared at the map with growing horror, counting the red indicators that surrounded their position in a nearly perfect circle, as if the infected hadn't just stumbled upon this location by accident but had deliberately chosen to establish themselves around it. They know what this place is, she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. They remember, don't they? Some of them were scientists, military personnel, people who worked here before they turned. Hayes' silence was confirmation enough, and she pulled up another screen showing archived security footage from 2 weeks prior. The video displayed a man in a tattered lab coat approaching the convenience store entrance, moving with clear purpose, his eyes intelligent and focused as he examined the building's exterior before tilting his head back and releasing a sound that brought dozens of other infected converging on his position. That's Dr. Richard Brennan, Patterson whispered, his voice breaking. He was my research partner, one of the first to be exposed when the containment failed. He's calling them, organizing them, and he knows exactly what's down here. The facility shuddered again, more violently this time, and the lights flickered before emergency backup systems kicked in, bathing everything in red. Hayes was already moving, leading them toward a heavy blast door at the far end of the command center, entering a 16-digit code that seemed to take forever as the sounds of destruction grew closer. Marcus checked the rifle she'd given him, finding it fully loaded with enough ammunition to make a difference in a firefight but nowhere near enough if they got surrounded by hundreds of infected. He thought of Emily again, wondered if she was facing the same impossible odds 300 miles away, and made a silent promise that he would find her no matter what it took, even if it meant fighting through an army of these evolved monsters. The blast door opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a tunnel that stretched into darkness, its walls lined with pipes and cables that hummed with electricity, and the four of them entered with Daniel now walking on his own, his small hand gripping his mother's with white-knuckled intensity. The tunnel was exactly as claustrophobic as Marcus had feared, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, with a ceiling low enough that he had to duck his head every few yards where support beams crossed overhead. Hayes took point with a flashlight attached to her tactical vest, while Marcus brought up the rear, constantly checking behind them for signs of pursuit. They'd made it perhaps half a mile when the sounds began echoing through the tunnel, not the mindless moaning they'd grown accustomed to but something far worse. Voices, distorted and broken but undeniably attempting speech, calling out words that almost made sense. "Doctor," one voice rasped from somewhere behind them. "Patterson, come back, we need you." Daniel pressed his face against Rebecca's side, and she could feel him shaking despite his brave attempts to stay quiet. Dr. Patterson stumbled, and Marcus caught him, seeing tears streaming down the old man's face as he recognized the voices of colleagues and friends who'd become something no longer human but not quite mindless either. Hayes picked up the pace, her tactical training evident in how she navigated obstacles and checked corners, but even she seemed rattled when they reached a junction where the tunnel branched in 3 directions and found fresh markings on the walls, crude symbols drawn in something dark that could have been blood or rust. "They've been down here," she said quietly, examining the symbols with a focused intensity. "These are territory markers, the same ones we've observed in other areas where Generation 2 populations have established control. They're communicating through a written language, something they've created or remembered from before." She chose the left tunnel without explaining her reasoning, and they pressed forward into darkness that seemed to grow heavier with each step, the air becoming thick and difficult to breathe as the tunnel angled slightly upward toward the surface. The exit came suddenly, a rusted ladder leading up to a hatch that Hayes tested carefully before cracking it open just enough to peer outside. What she saw made her freeze, and when Marcus moved forward to look, he understood why. They'd emerged in the basement of what had once been a shopping mall, but the infected had transformed it into something else entirely. The vast space had been reorganized with clear purpose. Areas designated for different functions, structures built from scavenged materials that looked almost like buildings within the building, and everywhere Generation 2 infected moving with coordination and intent that spoke of society rather than chaos. And standing in the center of it all, addressing a gathered crowd of several hundred infected, was Dr. Richard Brennan, his dead eyes scanning the assembled masses as he spoke in broken but improving sentences about purpose and evolution and the new world they would build from humanity's ashes.